Welcome back to Minnesota Matters. I'm Scott Peterson. Doris Kearns Goodwin is a Pulitzer-Prize winning author, historian, and biographer who has chronicled American presidents, including Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson. And she regularly makes the rounds on the Sunday morning political shows to offer her well-studied perspective. Her most recent book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, is just out in paperback. It seems like it's a book made for the times we're living in, and I asked Doris Kearns Goodwin if that was intentional.
Well, I started the book 6 years ago, so I had seen already that there was a difficulty for a decade or more getting compromise across the aisles and the kind of tribalism that we now see beginning to develop. But I really chose the Turbulent Times title because each one of my four leaders that I chose to focus on led in turbulent times. I just had no idea that it would become as relevant as it is today. And things are more intense now than they were when I started the book.
Of course, in the book you focus on the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, the Roosevelts, and Lyndon Johnson. You set out to answer the question, are leaders born or made? And I know that this is what the book is about, so it's hard to summarize it, but what conclusion did you come to?
Well, I think I came to the conclusion that there are certain gifts that you can be born with that are relevant to leadership. Lincoln was born with a gift for language. Teddy Roosevelt was lucky to have a photographic memory, everything he'd read or heard. And FDR was lucky to have that optimistic temperament from the time he was a baby. And LBJ just had this unbounded energy. But mostly they make themselves leaders by their ability to grow, from learning from their mistakes, by just developing over time. Teddy once wrote an essay saying there's two kinds of success in the world. The first is when somebody has a talent that someone else, no matter how hard they try to emulate, will never be able to do so, like a great poet or a great dramatist or a great runner. But most success in the world, and he included himself in that category, comes when when people develop ordinary qualities to an extraordinary degree through hard, sustained work and through the ability to grow. And I believe that was most of it for all of these guys and for most people in general.
And maybe you've addressed this, but in terms of positive leadership traits, is there something that all of the subjects in the book had in common?
I think so. I mean, there were certain things they had in common. There were certain things they didn't. I mean, they all seemed to have the self-confidence to surround themselves with strong-minded people who could disagree with him. Certainly in the early days, LBJ had that. When he got into Vietnam, there was more of a tendency to keep the people who agreed with him and wouldn't be arguing with him in power. They all were somehow able to communicate with the people in the country through stories. They were all storytellers. I mean, Lincoln, it wasn't just that he had a gift for language, but he was asked why he told so many stories when he spoke. He would tell a story of, here's where slavery began, here's where we are now, here's where we have to go. He said people remember stories better than facts and figures. They all stayed connected to the people. I mean, LBJ stayed connected to those congressmen. He called them every day, called them at noon, called them at midnight, called them at 2 a.m., he even called a senator at 2 a.m., and he said, I hope I didn't wake you up. The senator said, no, I was just lying here looking at the ceiling, hoping my president would call. And they all, except for LBJ, were able to control negative and unproductive emotions. But they all shared something, and LBJ absolutely shared this. They transformed what originally started as an ambition for self into an ambition for the greater good. And it happened to LBJ later after he had a massive heart attack. He just said, what would I be remembered for if I died now? It happened to Lincoln from the time he was young. And for the two Roosevelts, as they got into politics, they wanted to make life better for people. So that becomes a central core of what makes a great leader, that ambition being more than for self.
You alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but we're clearly in turbulent times as we speak, and our president is facing an impeachment inquiry. I'm curious, based on what you've learned and what you know from history, maybe there isn't a precedent for this, but do you think that President Trump can be an effective leader under these circumstances with this inquiry?
Well, clearly we know how much the inquiry takes up of the energy and the focus of the nation. Clinton was able somehow, when he was being impeached, for getting people to feel like he was still focusing on the problems of the country. And the way the impeachment hearings went, people still had a great approval rating for him. It was 66%. When he was first impeached by the House, it even went up because people felt not only was the economy doing well, but they didn't like what he had done personally, but they thought it was for the good of the country that he was working. So his impeachment turned out not to retard what was going on in quite the same way, although a lot of energy was lost. In the Nixon case, which I think is relevant for what's happening with Donald Trump today, at the beginning, only 16% wanted impeachment, so that was much lower than it is now. But still, the hearings were able to persuade public sentiment that it was important for Nixon to leave. And that's the challenge, I think, for the Democrats right now. It's going to be a bad thing if it just becomes seen at the end as a partisan endeavor, and that it was just, should they have waited for the next election. Instead, if they were able to persuade people, like the people who did the hearings in Nixon, that something had happened that was wrong, that Nixon had violated the rule of law, that the only answer was to have him leave for office, if public sentiment could be educated here, then the country might come through in a better way. When Ford finally took over after Nixon, he was able to say our long national nightmare is over. There was a consensus that it was the right thing to do. And without that consensus, at the end of this, things are only going to be divided more and more. So it's really important the way these hearings are conducted and whether or not public sentiment begins to shift and not hardened like it is right now on partisan sides.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I wanted to bring up your brilliant book, Team of Rivals. You talk about how Abraham Lincoln kept his enemies close, so to speak, by kind of keeping them in his cabinet, seeking out their counsel after he was elected president. And now we have that divisiveness, obviously, on social media. We tend to interact with people who only have the same opinions that we have. Do you think the concept of valuing a rival's opinion, is that something we're going to see in American politics again?
Well, I hope it comes back again. I think part of the problem now is because the intensity of anger on one party's side against the other. If you were to agree to become a part of a cabinet member, you might be considered a traitor to your party. Whereas before, people understood that this was a good thing for the country. Well, certainly for Lincoln's rivals, they recognized that the country was in peril just as Lincoln did, and they needed to help the country. So it was so important. It's not just even rivals politically. What you need in an inner circle are people who can question your assumptions, who can argue with you, different temperaments, so that they have different strengths that maybe are different from your own weaknesses. I mean, FDR liked to say that Eleanor was like a welcome thorn in his side. She was always willing to argue with him, always willing to question his assumptions, and that was so incredibly important for him as a leader. Somebody has to speak truth to power, whether it's a rival or whether it's just person temperamentally or even a friend who can do it. But without that, then the person is just an echo chamber. He's not getting anything other than what he himself believes.
And I know that we're running very short on time, so just one last question. The book is Leadership in Turbulent Times. In the country's brief history, have we had any non-turbulent times?
That's a good question. I mean, there are times when people settle back into what they might call normalcy, like they thought the 1920s would be that time, a return to normalcy after World War I. But soon the problems developed to become the Great Depression and World War II. And then maybe the 50s, and that what was called a silent generation, was more attuned to private life than public life. There are cycles Arthur Schlesinger used to write about where people are either very active in public life and lots of turbulence is going on, and then people settle back. But in general, I mean, things are difficult. It's a country that's a democracy. It's still trying to make itself better, and there's still unsolved problems. So the turbulence is always below the surface, even if it's not on the top.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
You are so welcome. Thank you.
The book Leadership in Turbulent Times is available everywhere books are sold. Minnesota Matters returns after this.